Picture this. It's 70,000 years ago. You've got no GPS, no shoes, no idea what's over that hill, and somehow your great times about 3,000. Grandparents decided, you know what, let's just walk to Australia. No boats worth mentioning, no maps, no Google reviews warning them about the local wildlife trying to kill them. And Australia's wildlife has always been trying to kill everyone. And yet they made it. So did the people who crossed into the Americas. So did the people who somehow ended up on tiny specks of land in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. Islands so small you could miss them by being a few degrees off course and just sail into oblivion. So how did this happen? How did a hairless ape with no claws, no fur, and frankly mediocre night vision become the only species to set foot on every continent except Antarctica, and even that one we eventually showed up to uninvited? Stick around, because this is the story of how humans turned "I wonder what's over there" into a full-blown planetary takeover, and it's a lot weirder and a lot more impressive than you were taught in school. Let's start at the very beginning, because the beginning is honestly kind of a flex. Modern humans, Homo sapiens, evolved in Africa somewhere around 300,000 years ago. For most of that time, we just stayed there. Like, a long time. If human history were a movie, the first 2 hours would just be Africa, and people would start checking their watches. But around 70,000 to 60,000 years ago, something changed. Small groups started pushing outward, and within an almost absurdly short window of time, geologically speaking, humans had spread to nearly every corner of the globe. We're talking Europe, Asia, Australia, the Americas, places separated by oceans, deserts, mountain ranges, and ice sheets that would make a modern hiker cry. And they did it without Velcro. Now, the obvious question is, why leave it all? Africa wasn't exactly a bad neighborhood. The answer, like most answers about ancient humans, is probably food, climate, and a healthy dose of not wanting your neighbors stealing all the good hunting grounds. Climate shifts during the Pleistocene caused droughts and resource crunches in parts of Africa, and population pressure meant groups were pushed to the margins, and sometimes the margins led right out of the continent. There's also a less practical, more human reason: curiosity. We are, as a species, pathologically nosy. Give a human a horizon, and they will wonder what's past it. This is the same instinct that makes you click on a video titled, "How did ancient humans travel the world?" So really, you're proof the theory holds up. The first big migration out of Africa is often called the Out of Africa migration, which, I'll be honest, sounds like the title of a much less interesting documentary. Researchers debate the exact routes, but the leading theories involve groups moving across the Bab el-Mandeb Strait, that narrow gap separating the Horn of Africa from the Arabian Peninsula. During glacial periods, sea levels were much lower than today, which meant that strait wasn't nearly as wide or as deep. Some researchers think it might have even been crossable on foot or with extremely basic rafts during certain periods. So picture it: a small group, maybe a few dozen people, kids included, looking out at a strip of water, deciding that yes, today is the day we become invasive species on a new continent. Once across, they didn't sprint to Beijing. Human migration wasn't some grand expedition with a 5-year plan and a PowerPoint presentation. It was slow, painfully, almost comically slow by modern standards. Groups would move a little, settle for a generation or two, then push a bit further when resources got tight, or curiosity got the better of the younger folks. Multiply that incremental creeping outward by tens of thousands of years, and suddenly you've colonized an entire hemisphere without anyone ever really deciding to. It's less Indiana Jones, more, we kept walking until Grandma said this spot has good water and fewer lions. This brings us to one of the most underrated survival tools in human history: the coastline. Forget rugged mountain men hacking through jungle. A huge amount of early human movement happened by hugging coastlines. Coasts are basically nature's all-you-can-eat buffet. Shellfish, fish, seaweed, birds, eggs. Coastal environments are absurdly rich in food compared to inland deserts or forests, and crucially, that food doesn't require you to invent the bow and arrow first. You can grab a clam with your bare hands. Even a toddler can do it, and toddlers were absolutely along for these migrations because humans don't pause reproduction just because they're busy colonizing a planet. This coastal route theory helps explain one of the wildest migration stories in human history: how people got to Australia roughly 65,000 years ago, give or take a few thousand years depending on which archaeologist you ask and how recently they've had coffee. Australia was never connected to Asia by a land bridge, even during the lowest sea levels of the Ice Age. There was always open water to cross, and not just a narrow channel you could paddle across on a log while feeling brave. We're talking potentially dozens of kilometers of open ocean, multiple times island hopping through what's now Indonesia. That means humans were building boats, or at least sturdy enough rafts, tens of thousands of years before anything resembling written history. And they weren't just doing it once by accident. Evidence suggests multiple successful crossings, which means it wasn't a fluke. It was a strategy. Somebody, somewhere, figured out boat building, taught it to others, and it stuck. We don't have the boats themselves, because organic materials don't exactly survive 65,000 years, but we have the only proof that matters. Humans showed up in Australia, and Australia is an island. The math works out whether we like it or not. And can we talk about how terrifying that journey actually was? You're on a raft made of bamboo and vines. You can't see land in any direction, you don't know if there's anything out there, and your entire species' track record with long ocean voyages up to this point is essentially zero. There was no rescue boat, no emergency flare, just vibes, paddles, and an alarming amount of faith in your local boat builder. And yet here we are, with their descendants having built one of the oldest continuous cultures on Earth. Meanwhile, up north, a very different kind of migration story was unfolding, and this one involves ice. A lot of ice. During the last ice age, so much of the planet's water was locked up in glaciers that sea levels dropped dramatically, by well over 100 meters in places. This exposed huge stretches of land that are now underwater, and one of the most famous of these is Beringia, the land bridge that once connected Siberia to Alaska, where the Bering Strait is today. Calling it a bridge undersells it a bit, though. It wasn't some narrow strip you'd nervously tiptoe across. At its widest, Beringia was over 1,000 kilometers across. It wasn't a bridge so much as an entire extra continent that just happened to be temporary. People moved into this region, and it wasn't some quick dash across. There's strong evidence that groups lived in Beringia itself for thousands of years before ever pushing further into the Americas, an idea sometimes called the Beringian standstill. Basically, imagine spending multiple millennia just hanging out in what is now one of the coldest, most unforgiving environments on the planet, slowly adapting, slowly building up the population and the know-how needed to push further. Then, eventually, when conditions allowed, groups moved south into the Americas. And here's where it gets contentious, because exactly how they did that is still hotly debated. For decades, the dominant theory was the ice-free corridor, a gap that supposedly opened up between two massive ice sheets covering what's now Canada, letting people walk south between the ice like some kind of glacial hallway. The problem is, more recent research suggests this corridor might not have been usable, or even fully open, until well after humans were already showing up further south in the Americas. Which means people likely got there another way. And the leading alternative is, you guessed it, the coast again. The Kelp Highway hypothesis suggests that people moved down the Pacific coastline, using boats, surviving off rich coastal and marine resources, basically island hopping and shore hugging their way from Alaska down to South America. Coastlines really do seem to be humanity's favorite cheat code. This matters because of just how fast humans seem to have spread once they got into the Americas. There's solid evidence of human presence in South America, places like Chile, dating back over 14,000 years, and some controversial findings suggesting it might even be older than that. If people were walking through an interior ice corridor, the timeline gets uncomfortably tight to explain populations showing up at the opposite end of two entire continents that quickly. A coastal route, where you can move quickly by boat and live off abundant seafood the whole way, fits the evidence a lot more comfortably. So the people who crossed into Alaska weren't just trudging through snow with spears, They were very possibly fishing, paddling, and coast-hopping their way down two continents in what is, again, a stunningly short window of time when you consider the distances involved. Now let's jump to what might be the single most jaw-dropping migration story in all of human history: the colonization of the Pacific Islands. If crossing to Australia sounds intense, and the Beringian journey sounds impressive, the settlement of the Pacific is on an entirely different level, because we're not talking about island hopping along a visible coastline anymore. We're talking about deliberately sailing out into the open ocean, sometimes for thousands of kilometers, with no land in sight, toward islands you don't even know exist yet, using nothing but the stars, the swells, the clouds, and the flight patterns of birds. This is the story of the Austronesian expansion, beginning thousands of years ago from around Taiwan and the surrounding region, spreading through the Philippines, into Indonesia, and eventually out into the vast emptiness of the Pacific Ocean. And when I say vast, I mean the Pacific Ocean covers about a third of the Earth's entire surface. It is, by a wide margin, the largest geographical feature on the planet, and ancient sailors decided that was a fun place to go exploring with handmade canoes. The technology that made this possible deserves way more credit than it gets. We're talking about the double-hulled canoe, essentially two canoe hulls connected by a platform which gave incredible stability for long ocean voyages, something a single hull just can't match in open swells. Pair that with sophisticated sail designs, and you've got vessels genuinely capable of crossing open ocean reliably, not just surviving it by luck. But the boats were only half the story. The real superpower was navigation, and ancient Pacific navigators developed systems so sophisticated that some of them are still taught and used today. These wayfinders, as they're often called, didn't have compasses or sextants. Instead, they memorized the rising and setting points of dozens, sometimes over 100, stars, building a mental star compass that let them hold a course through the night. During the day, they read ocean swells, literally feeling the rhythm of waves through the hull of the canoe to detect distant islands disrupting the water's pattern long before land was visible. They watched cloud formations, since clouds often build up differently over islands than over open ocean. They tracked the flight paths of seabirds, which travel out to fish during the day, but reliably return to land at dusk, meaning a navigator who spotted the right bird at the right time of day basically had a living compass pointing the way home. This wasn't superstition. This was an extraordinarily precise, generationally refined science, passed down orally because writing it down wasn't really an option. And somehow it worked well enough to settle nearly every habitable island across an ocean covering a third of the planet. And the scale of it is staggering. The Polynesian expansion alone eventually connected Hawaii in the north, New Zealand in the south, and Easter Island, one of the most remote inhabited places on Earth, in the east, a triangle so massive it covers an area larger than Russia, Canada, China, and the United States combined. All of it settled using canoes and the kind of navigational skill that makes modern GPS look a little embarrassing in comparison. These voyages weren't accidents either. Evidence increasingly points to deliberate planned expeditions, sometimes even round trips, where explorers would sail out, find new land, and then sail back to bring colonists, livestock, and crops. That means somewhere out there, ancient sailors were doing reconnaissance missions across the open Pacific Ocean thousands of years before anyone in Europe was confident enough to sail out of sight of the coastline. It's worth pausing here to really sit with how counterintuitive this all is. We tend to imagine ancient people as primitive, fumbling around with sticks and rocks, barely surviving. And sure, life was hard, brutal in ways that are difficult to even imagine today. But the technology required to deliberately and repeatedly cross open ocean, to navigate without instruments, to build seaworthy vessels using stone tools and natural fibers, that's not primitive, that's genius. It's just genius dressed in a loincloth instead of a lab coat, which historically tends to get a lot less credit. Let's also not forget the journeys that happened on foot, because not everyone had access to oceans and coastlines. Humans pushed into Siberia, into some of the coldest, harshest environments on the planet. Places where the technology required wasn't boats, but clothing, fire management, and shelter design sophisticated enough to survive winters that would kill an unprepared person in hours. Tailored clothing, made with bone needles and animal sinew, wasn't a luxury. It was the only thing standing between a person and hypothermia in environments that regularly dropped to temperatures that sound made up. The needle, frankly, might be one of the most underrated inventions in human history. No needle, no tailored clothing. No tailored clothing, no surviving Siberian winters, no surviving Siberian winters, no eventual migration into the Americas via the north. An entire hemisphere's worth of human history potentially hinges on someone figuring out how to poke a hole in a bone and thread it with sinew. There's also the matter of dogs, because no migration story is complete without humanity's oldest and most loyal travel buddy. Domesticated dogs were already traveling alongside humans tens of thousands of years ago, helping with hunting, providing warning of predators, and probably providing a fair amount of warmth on freezing nights when central heating wasn't exactly an option. Some researchers think the partnership between early humans and dogs may have given certain groups a meaningful survival edge over other human relatives, like Neanderthals, who, as far as we know, didn't have the same close working relationship with canines. Imagine that. Your ancestors might have outcompeted an entire other species of human partly because they were better at making friends with wolves. And speaking of other human species, here's a fun wrinkle. When modern humans were spreading across the globe, we weren't alone. Neanderthals were already established across Europe and parts of Asia. Denisovans occupied parts of Asia too, known mostly from a few bone fragments and a genome that punches way above its archaeological weight. Homo floresiensis, the so-called hobbits, lived on the island of Flores in Indonesia, standing around a meter tall and apparently surviving there for tens of thousands of years in isolation. Modern humans encountered these other human species during their migrations, and we know this not just from fossils, but from something far more personal: our DNA. Most people with ancestry outside of Africa carry a small percentage of Neanderthal DNA, and some populations in Southeast Asia and Oceania carry meaningful amounts of Denisovan DNA as well. Which means that for a stretch of human history, our species' great migration across the planet wasn't just an empty world to explore. It was a shared world, at least for a while before those other human species eventually disappeared, and we, somewhat awkwardly, carried pieces of them forward inside our own genomes. So when you zoom out and look at the whole picture, what you get is honestly one of the most underrated stories in all of human history, within a window that's almost laughably short compared to the timescale of human evolution. A species with no claws, no fangs, no fur, no natural weapons to speak of, managed to walk, raft, and sail its way across literally every habitable landmass on Earth. We crossed straits on rafts before we had writing. We survived Ice Age winters with needle and thread. We sailed thousands of kilometers across open ocean using stars and wave patterns as our only instruments. We outsurvived other human species, possibly with the help of dogs we'd only just started befriending. And we did it all driven by the same basic instincts that are still recognizably human today: curiosity, the need to find food and safety, and that nagging feeling that there's probably something interesting just over the horizon. It's worth remembering that none of this was inevitable. At dozens of points along the way, these migrations could have failed entirely. A raft could have sunk in that first crossing toward Australia. A group could have died out completely during the Beringian standstill before ever reaching the Americas. A canoe could have missed Hawaii by a fraction of a degree and simply vanished into the largest ocean on Earth, never to be heard from again. The fact that we have a written, oral, archaeological, and genetic record of these journeys at all means that, against some genuinely brutal odds, enough of these journeys succeeded. Every single person alive today is the descendant of an unbroken chain of survivors going back through every one of these crossings, every one of these winters, every one of these open ocean voyages into the unknown. So next time you're annoyed about a long car ride or dreading a layover at the airport, maybe spare a thought for the people who looked out at an unbroken horizon of open ocean with nothing but a hand-carved canoe and a deep, possibly slightly unreasonable amount of confidence, and decided to go for it anyway. We are, every single one of us, descended from people who simply refuse to stay put. And honestly, that might be the most human trait of all.